Good evening. We're very pleased to have you with us tonight for a very special program and a very special speaker. This evening's program is brought to you by both the National Archives and Records Administration, our parent organization, and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. That's usually what happens when people turn lights off on me. And I would like to thank the trustees, including President Ford's brother, Dick. Is he still here? Hi, Dick, how are you? Dick and the Foundation's Executive Board Director, Joe Calvaruso, who is here tonight. We are very grateful to all of you who are members of the Friends of Ford and contributors to the Foundation. It is your ongoing support that makes possible our feature exhibits, research travel grants, and public programs like this one. Finally, before we get started, please turn off or silence your cell phones. I would appreciate that. Now to tonight's program. Richard Norton Smith is no stranger to the Ford Presidential Library and Museum. He served as director from 1996 to 2001 and has done research at both locations. He will be starting a biography of Gerald Ford next month, and we look forward to his future visits. He is nationally recognized authority on the American presidency and a familiar face to viewers of C-SPAN, as well as the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, where he appears regularly as part of the show's national table of historians. I'm sorry, is there a little feedback going on out there? Okay. Is this better? Yes. Okay, thank you. Smith graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University with a degree in government. Following graduation, he worked as a White House intern during the Ford administration and as a freelance writer for the Washington Post. In 1977, Mr. Smith became a speechwriter for Massachusetts Senator Edward Brooke. 2 years later, he went to work for Senator Bob Dole. He is perhaps best known as a historian and biographer. Among many others, he has written biographies of Thomas Dewey, George Washington, Herbert Hoover, and Robert McCormick. But Rockefeller's biography, Richard has said, is the book I was born to write. Between 1987 and 2001, Mr. Smith served as director of the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library, the Dwight D. Eisenhower Library, the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and Museum, as well as this institution. He spent the next 5 years as the founding director of both the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics at the University of Kansas and the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, Illinois. There are several published works written about Rockefeller. However, the New Yorker says that Richard Norton Smith has written what will probably stand as a definitive life. Other high praise for On His Own Terms, A Life of Nelson Rockefeller, comes from many fellow historians who have called it an insightful account of a struggle for the soul of the Republican Party 50 years ago. Another mentioned that Richard Norton Smith has brought us a gripping, magisterial, deeply researched life of one of the most intriguing figures in American political history. In this comment, calling Smith's biography one of the greatest cradle-to-grave biographies written in the past 50 years. It's never dull and always joyfully lucid. And Mr. Smith would agree with that, because he has stated there is no excuse for a dull book, a dull museum, a dull speech, especially when dealing with history, the most fascinating subject I know. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Norton Smith.
Thanks, Kim. Very kind. characteristically so. Whatever we were able to accomplish here during those frenetic 6 years was very much a team effort. Jim was very much a part of that, and as were indeed all of the folks in the front row. And everyone who cares about this town's not only most famous native son, but best gentleman as well. We are the greatest state in the greatest nation in the most exciting period in the history of the world. And we find ourselves bogged down with frustrations and harassed by problems and uncertainties when we should be concentrating our attention with enthusiasm and excitement on shaping the forces of the future. Ronald Reagan did not say that. Franklin D. Roosevelt did not say that. You guessed it, Nelson Rockefeller said that. It's one key to a man who was so complex, so elusive, so successful in hiding his tracks. Indeed, sometimes I think even hiding his feelings from himself, that it took me 14 years to even imperfectly discover the real Nelson Rockefeller. Visitors, if you were a visitor after January of 1959 to Albany's ramshackle old executive mansion, home to New York governors since Samuel J. Tilden, odds are you were unprepared for the total makeover of the place that Teddy Roosevelt's children had not so favorably compared to a railroad terminal. Walls only recently given over to Averell Harriman's distinguished Gilbert Stuart portraits now groaned under the weight of Picasso and Pollock and Motherwell. Nelson Rockefeller can be defined not by his politics, but by his art. If you went to his 34-room triplex apartment on Fifth Avenue, in the living room you saw a fireplace painted by Henri Matisse, personally. The Giacometti brothers did the andirons. I remember talking to Mark Hatfield, who had the experience of being given a grand tour of that grand living space by its owner, and just being blown away everywhere you went. Nelson used to complain that he was out of walls. He said he'd been out of walls for years. And so he had closets full of Brancusi sculptures, and it's just astonishing. Anyway, at the end of this tour, Hatfield said, "Nelson, I have to ask you, of all your collections, which one gives you the most pleasure?" And he said, "Oh, Mark, that's easy. It's my china." He says, "Sometimes I get up in the middle of the night just to set the table." The very rich are different from you and me. Members of Philistines in the New York State Legislature suggested that the governor's painting should be referred to the Select Committee on Pornography. And Rockefeller's own press secretary wondered out loud whether, in fact, the American people were prepared to elect a president who collected modern art. It's a fair question. Hanging in the front hall of the mansion, where its formless splotches of color mystified many a caller, Richard Lytle's composition was said to be Nelson's favorite canvas. In the words of his first wife, Todd, "It's a completely abstract painting. It means something different to each person." The same could be said of its owner. And that's one reason it took me 14 years to complete. You know, everywhere I go, well, particularly I'm on a book promotion tour, and the state of the modern media being what it is, people want you to explain in a nutshell. Give me in a nutshell, who was Nelson Rockefeller? And then they want to know why it took 14 years. Anyway, I've tried to take those 14 years and squeeze them into 721 pages of text. And I'm trying to squeeze the 721 pages of text into about 40 minutes of prose this evening. And then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. The typical political biography is not terribly complex. The the structure is already laid out in many ways. It's a story of elections won and lost, of bills passed or vetoed, of programs conceived and introduced. But this is not a political biography in any conventional sense because, again, Nelson Rockefeller was not in any conventional way a politician. That's just one of the things that everyone thinks they know, including myself 14 years ago. And I'd like to just go through a list and disprove a number of those commonly held assumptions. First of all, his name, Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. Turns out he was much more an Aldrich than he was a Rockefeller. What does that mean? His mother, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, is in many ways the pivotal figure. His son Stephen said to me, probably the only woman his father ever truly, totally loved. The old cliche about men marrying their mothers, Nelson did it twice. It took me a while to unravel, but each of his wives was Abby, or a part of Abby in miniature. Her father was the politician in the family. Nelson Aldrich, senator from Rhode Island, was Republican Senate leader at the turn of the 20th century, genially corrupt in the way that we associate with the Gilded Age, but also a great art collector. That's where it came from. It was said that when Nelson was born, Abby announced, I've done my duty by this family. I've given you a John D. III. This one's mine. Whether she said it or not doesn't matter because that's certainly how she behaved. She was the one who told Nelson when he was 7 years old that he could be president of the United States. Today, she would be the candidate. Nelson was her surrogate. From her, he got so much. His love of people, his curiosity about people, his love of new ideas and new forms of artistic expression. It was Abby, after all, who really, more than anyone else, created the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And it was Nelson, who was president later on, who saved it at a critical moment in its infancy financially through a $100,000 anonymous donation that he got from his father. But anyway, the duality of this man. I've never met a more complex figure, certainly never written about one, but I've never met anyone who is more perfectly, symmetrically a compound, sometimes unstable, but a compound of two people, Abby and his father, John D., known in the family as Junior. At the age of 80, he was Junior. And then, of course, the Aldriches and the Rockefellers. The duality of this man. I had been told by someone close to Nelson that he kept his mother's ashes in Kykuit, the big manor house up on the hill. It's Dutch for lookout. If you've been to, how many of you have ever been to Peconico or been to Kykuit? Well, okay. Nelson grew up on a 4,000 acre estate, and his father gave him an allowance of 30 cents a week. And they had a game of financial let's pretend. His mother, on the other hand, was all about fun. The story was that he, in fact, when Abby died of a massive heart attack, remember that, in 1948, that Nelson kept her ashes in an urn in what's called Mother's Room. Every Rockefeller house is built on the same floor plan. When you walk in, on the right is Mother's Room, and on the left is Father's Room. Happy Rockefeller, his second wife, was kind enough to spend a day with me early in this process, and she gave me a tour of Kykuit before we went to their retirement home called Japanese House. People always ask what kind of president Nelson would have been. All you need to know, in 1969, he took out a building permit for $450,000 to build Japanese House as a retirement home. It was completed 6 years later at a cost of $5.5 million. He imported the gravel from Japan, which gives you some idea. But his father always used to say, it's the last 5% that counts. He was more his father's son than he suspected, but he was first and always his mother's son. Anyway, we're standing outside Mother's room, and I relate this story not knowing what kind of reaction I'm going to get. And Mrs. Rockefeller said, "Oh, that's true." I said, "Really? But now, Mrs. Rockefeller, how could that be?" There was a funeral, and Abby's ashes were interred elsewhere in the state on the private family cemetery. And she said, "Oh, Nelson just reached in and grabbed a handful." Now, that tells me two things. There's a kind of almost childlike impulsiveness and total lack of self-consciousness, which, you stop and figure, contributed to one of the great political campaigners of all time. Nelson Rockefeller loved people. He was curious about people. It was a lifelong trait. He cared about people. And that's something he got from his mother. But it also suggests a kind of entitlement that borders on the creepy, quite frankly. I said he was also his father's son. He used to quote his father, who said, "Never show more surface than necessary." Nelson's daughter Mary once said, "We, the family, only wish we knew him," Nelson, her father, as well as the voters of New York. Of course, the voters of New York knew what Nelson wanted them to know. They knew this back-slapping, blintz-eating, tax-raising force of nature who never saw a vacant lot he didn't want to build on, and who used to say, and it's what a formula, he used to say his definition of government, the purpose of government, was to convert problems into opportunities. When's the last time you heard anyone define government in that way? That is totally consistent with the upbeat, optimistic, dare I say, Reagan-esque words that I read at the beginning. But he was his father's son in other ways as well. Someone who I knew, he ran the state of New York from two twin houses, townhouses, creaking old things on 55th Street, not far from Rockefeller Center. And they were connected with, on 54th Street, with two houses, one of which his parents had lived in the first 10 years of their marriage, and that, by the way, is the house in which he died in January of 1979. But he had these twin townhouses, not well connected, and anyway, it's kind of crazy. But that's where they worked. Someone who went on to the staff told me the story. The first week he was there, he noticed the governor's car, big Chrysler limousine with a New York 1 license plate, not discreet, parked outside of 20 West 55th. And the governor was in it, in the back seat, scribbling away on some papers. And he noticed, he was curious, and he was there for a half hour before he got out of the car and went into the building. And he noticed it happened another day that week. And anyway, finally he kind of screwed up the courage to ask him. And he said, "Oh, that was my father." He said, he told me, never start the new day's work until you finish the old days. And so if he'd been out the night before, going around to a bunch of events, dropping in, political reasons or whatever, and had not finished, he was a dyslexic all his life, who never heard the word until he was 50 years old, went through life thinking he had a deficient IQ. And he prided himself, incredibly self-disciplined, he prided himself on returning every piece of paper that crossed his desk the next morning. And if that meant sitting in the car for 45 minutes to do it, that's fine. And finally, he was more like his father in a way that was bordering on the tragic. In 1914, Junior was still associated with the family business. He had basically decided he didn't want to go into business. He didn't want to be part of Standard Oil. He would practice philanthropy. And frankly, he and his wife and children would redeem the Rockefeller name, although he would never put it in those terms. All the more ironic that he became the face of what was known as the Ludlow Massacre. In Colorado, strike action by coal miners, the National Guard was sent in, several miners and members of their families were killed. It was a great national scandal. The Rockefeller name was besmirched as never before. And guess what? 60 years later came something called Attica. And we'll get to that later, but I believe history does repeat itself. It repeated itself that weekend when Nelson Rockefeller decided not to go to Attica to negotiate with the prisoners or anyone else. He was, in effect, reliving his father's life and experiencing his father's fate. He was not a politician who collected art. He was a frustrated artist for whom politics gave him a chance to indulge his need to create and to control. If you've ever been to Albany and you've seen the South Mall, which now bears his name, you've seen both tendencies. Imagine today the governor of a great state deciding he would knock down 99 acres of the state capital on which 3,000 people happen to be living. Nelson got away with it, and the result is what some people call Brasilia on the Hudson. Those are the generous ones. Anyway, you have to see it. It's a work of art, literally. The buildings are all geodesic. There's something called the egg. Nelson Rockefeller created the first state arts council in America. He believed government had an absolute moral obligation to support culture, which is his word for us. It's the core of who we are. And so his government complex needed to have a performing arts center. It's called the egg. It's a shape that had never been designed. And in fact, the most sophisticated computers in the world were brought in to actually design this. But first, he gave instructions one morning at breakfast. He's a dyslexic. That means, among other things, he has a unique kind of visual intelligence. He's not good with words, but he's good at pictures. It's no accident, charts and graphs. And anyway, at breakfast, he takes half a grapefruit and he sticks it on top of a little milk carton. And he said, "That's what I want." And that's what he got. If you see it today, you can decide whether it looks more like an egg, but it doesn't look like anything else. But the remarkable thing is, he got whatever he wanted, most of the time. Once in a while, someone new to the circle, hearing the governor run on about his latest enthusiasm and his latest idea, and they would say, Governor, that's a great idea, but the problem is money. And Rockefeller invariably would say, no, money's not the problem, money's the solution. The problem is, where do I get the money? He usually found a way. Creative. It doesn't begin to hint. During his 15 years in Albany, it was said he owned one political party and rented the other. And I tell you, the lease wasn't high. He got along better with Democrats than he did with Republicans. New York, under Rockefeller, was absolutely in the vanguard of civil rights, mass transit, urban housing, labor law, mental health, aid to private education, and consumer protection. New York, under Rockefeller, in 1 year spent more money fighting water pollution than the federal government did in all 50 states. But the same applies to transportation and housing. On his watch, mandatory seatbelt laws were enacted, the first state minimum wage law in America, no-fault auto insurance, an overhaul of the state's antiquated divorce laws. He signed bills ending the death penalty and legalizing abortion. If you want to know one reason Nelson Rockefeller still matters, in 1970, at his behest, by one vote, the legislature repealed the state's 150-year-old, very restrictive abortion law. Almost immediately, the debate broke out, which continues to this day, and many, including, but by no means limited to the church, began appealing to the legislature to undo what it had just done. And in 1972, an election year, they were successful. The legislature narrowly repealed its repeal. Nelson vetoed their action, and the reasons he cited would be cited by the Supreme Court 9 months later in the Roe v. Wade case. He said basically, repealing this action does not mean there will not be abortions in New York State. It means only that poor women will either not be able to have one at all or will risk her life itself in a desperate attempt to have the procedure done. In other words, women who have sufficient money or connections will still be able to avail themselves of the procedure. And that, again, it seems to me, goes to the heart of one of the things that made Nelson Rockefeller, even then, different. He said, I believe if you have poor health or an inadequate education, then society has let you down. When did the last time you heard anyone say that? The notion that there is such a thing as society, that we are a collective body of individuals with a sense of mutual regard, mutual obligation to one another, but particularly to those that are the most vulnerable in our society. To him, it wasn't ideological. It wasn't left or right. The late, great Jack Gemond, who covered him in Albany and Washington, told me Nelson wasn't a liberal. He was a Baptist, which is actually a very shrewd insight. Nelson was the product of a very strict Baptist upbringing, but a strain of Baptism that, again, took into consideration, and particularly as a Rockefeller. Nelson believed that just as his family had an obligation to justify its wealth by giving back to society, he believed so the United States, the richest nation on earth, had its own obligation. And that's one of the things for which he is least remembered and should be most remembered. Had he never been governor of New York, had he never run for president, had he never been vice president, he would still be a man who in 1937, at the age of 29, the year his grandfather died, on his own went to Venezuela to look at the operations of Standard Oil and was appalled at what he saw. He saw compounds of Anglos, none of whom spoke Spanish, living surrounded by barbed wire, absolutely cut off from the natives, as they referred to them. He came back from that trip with his eyes open. He spoke to the annual meeting of Standard Oil, the first one after his grandfather's death, and he outlined what he had seen and the changes. For example, from now on, if you were going to work for Standard Oil in Latin America, you were going to learn Spanish or Portuguese. You were going to fit into the, quote, native population. And as he sat down, the chairman of the meeting leaned over to him and said, I didn't know we had a communist in our midst. Well, then at the age of 32, this scion of America's leading Republican family is entrusted by Franklin D. Roosevelt with oversight of South America. He becomes his wartime Latin American coordinator, and he creates something called the Basic Economy Program, which takes ideas from the Rockefeller Foundation and which shares American expertise and know-how, but on a sliding scale. So in other words, at the end of 5 years, with the numbers changing every year, initially 100% of this is funded from the United States. By the end of the 5 years, 100% of it is being funded locally. I mean, it's a remark. He had his own foreign aid program. After the war, Harry Truman fired him, and he created, on a private scale, something the likes of which had never been known, the International Basic Economy Corporation, which was a two-headed being. He said there was a Sunday company and a company for the rest of the week. The company for the rest of the week was supposed to make enough profits through fishing and farming and dairy products and food processing, all new to Venezuela, all designed to teach Venezuelans and others how to run a business. And the money, the profits, Instead of going back to the dividend holders, the profits would then be invested in a separate philanthropic, educational, health improving operation. In other words, he wanted what he called a better capitalism. No one was more supportive of the basic capitalist concept. Nelson told William F. Buckley in 1970, when Buckley, preeminent conservative, endorsed Rockefeller for a fourth term as governor. But before he said, no one has more to conserve than I do. He says, I'm the natural conservative. And he wasn't blowing smoke, but he was a Teddy Roosevelt conservative. Now, to some of you, that sounds like an oxymoron. Think about Benjamin Disraeli, if you want. In England, Disraeli created a property-owning democracy. Benjamin Disraeli was wedded to the powers that be. But he was smart enough to look beyond the horizon, beyond the next election, and to realize change is coming. Industrialization is producing all kinds of inequities in the capitalist system. Therefore, it is the special obligation and opportunity of conservatives who want to protect that system to embrace reform of that system and therefore ward off the possibility of revolution. That's exactly what Teddy Roosevelt did with food and drug laws, taking on the trusts, campaigning for better working conditions. TR was not a radical. He only seemed radical to J.P. Morgan. But the fact of the matter is TR and then his cousin FDR, who basically saved democratic capitalism from itself, and who is today criticized mostly from the left for failing to take advantage of the opportunity afforded by the Great Depression to, for example, nationalize the banks. I mean, that's an argument that is still going on today. It's another reason why Nelson Rockefeller still matters, because although it's tempting to write him off as a political dinosaur, as the liberal Republican, the rhino, a Republican in name only, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the fact of the matter is he is part of a tradition older than any of us, at least as old as Teddy Roosevelt. And by the way, when he was 6 years old, Nelson was 6 years old, guess who came to visit? Former President Theodore Roosevelt, just back from Africa. And classic Nelson. Any other kid would have been awed into silence. Nelson jumped up in his lap and wanted to know right away, how did you get those giraffes through the Holland Tunnel? The way his mind worked. And TR, who was immensely charmed by this sort of younger version of himself, explained that there was a very complicated series of polars, of levees, and that's how you get the neck down and so forth. Anyway, I don't think he bought it. Nelson once said, I was a skeptic. He said, I didn't even really buy this Santa Claus business. To which I say, if you're a Rockefeller, who needs Santa Claus? Right? The divorce and remarriage did not keep him from the White House. It gave people a lot to talk about. 50 years later, it's hard for some people to appreciate just how vitriolic was the response at the time. It certainly didn't help him. But what kept him from the White House was timing and temperament. By 1960, when he was first on the national scene, a mutation was already taking place in the Republican Party. It wasn't 2 weeks before the election between Nixon and Kennedy, very close election. Barry Goldwater calls the Republican national chairman. And being Goldwater, of course, he has some advice, unvarnished advice to give. He says, Nixon shouldn't waste any of his time in the Northeast, i.e. New York, i.e. African-American voters. He should spend his time in Illinois and Texas. Well, it's actually not bad advice, but he couldn't stop there. He said, I'd like to win this goddamn election without New York. He said, then we could tell New York to kiss our ass, and we could start a really conservative party. Well, guess what? That's exactly what happened. Barry Goldwater not only won the nomination in 1964 after one of the great epic battles of American political history, at least the equivalent of TR and Taft in 1912. But more important, he got to write the history books, because as we all know, winners write the history. He may not have won the presidency, but he wasn't interested in winning the presidency. Goldwater was always interested, first and foremost, in making sure the Republican Party was a conservative party. In the end, it became arguably even more conservative than Goldwater himself had envisioned. And there certainly would be no room in it today for Nelson Rockefeller. I'm not sure there'd be room in it for Gerald Ford, at least Gerald Ford in his later years. But on the other hand, people love, especially pundits, love to pronounce an end to history, you know? When Goldwater lost 44 states in 1964, it was fashionable to say it's the death of conservatism, it's the death of the Republican Party. And guess what? 1 week after that election, Gallup took a poll and asked people, do you consider yourself liberal or conservative? 50% said they were liberals and 49% said they were conservatives. That's a week after LBJ took 61% of the popular vote. And of course, history since attests to what I'm saying. The next time anyone says to you, it's the end of a party or the end of a philosophy, you know, just remind them of that. Nelson Rockefeller may be out of fashion. There's no doubt about that. He's a man without a party, but you know what? Millions of people are without parties. In some odd way, he is more relevant today because his approach to government, he said, I have a Democratic heart and a Republican head. A friend of his, a wonderful, colorful, Runyon-esque boss named Meade Esposito from Brooklyn, Democratic chairman who was part of the party that Nelson leased, explained it very simply. He never became president, he said, because he was too liberal for the Republicans and too conservative for the Democrats. That's 40 years ago, before we became so polarized as we are today. But what I'm trying to say is there are millions and millions of people who today wouldn't call themselves Rockefeller Republicans, either because they're not familiar with the term or because they find it offensive in some ways. But the fact of the matter is, they're Rockefeller Republicans because they are pragmatists. They are problem solvers, first and foremost. Nelson had a very simple philosophy. It would be wonderful if all our problems could be solved exclusively through the private sector. But that's not possible. So when that's not possible, he would look for a hybrid of government and the private sector. And only then, if it didn't work, would he turn to government. And I could bore you with all sorts of examples. The downside of this, of course, is his optimism blew up in his face. He believed there was no such thing as a problem that could not be solved. Okay? Then he encountered drugs. One of the things that people hold against him today, particularly on the left, are the Rockefeller drug laws, the punitive laws, which in their original format were designed so that a housewife giving her neighbor over the fence diet pills could go to jail for 15 years. But in 1973, guess what? 70% of the people of New York thought that was just fine. Even higher percentages in minority neighborhoods where the scourge of drugs was running havoc. But here's the point. The Rockefeller drug laws, so-called, were the third distinct program that Nelson Rockefeller introduced to fight drugs. The first two were therapeutic. They didn't work. He said to a friend one day in a car, he said, you know, I've wasted $1 billion fighting drugs with nothing to show for it, which is why he tried a third time. Then I remember talking to his brother Lawrence before he died, who said, you know, if Nelson had had a fifth term in Albany, there would have been another drug law, another drug program, because, and that in some ways is the downside of Nelsonian optimism. He tested federalism to the absolute limit. He tested what a state, even a rich state like New York, could do, both to lead the way, to serve as an example, and also to try to eliminate problems on their own. For example, it's one thing to clean up the Hudson River and New York Harbor, but what do you do with the Great Lakes, who, after all, are shared with several other states? Anyway, sometimes optimism is good, and sometimes optimism can be misplaced. Two quick things, and then we'll open this up. One thing that really mattered a lot, and it should be pointed out because Attica is often cited as a contrast. Civil rights mattered to Nelson Rockefeller. It wasn't just a family tradition. It mattered. I found when he was a boy of 13, he was paying the tuition of a young African-American student at the Hampton Institute in Virginia. In 1958, when a crazed assailant in Harlem stabbed Martin Luther King on a book tour, his hospital bills were all paid by Nelson Rockefeller in private. When Southern churches were burned, Nelson Rockefeller secretly paid for their reconstruction. In 1963, at the height of the civil rights movement, the absolute spine in Birmingham, known as Birmingham to many, the most segregated South city in America, a tough nut for Dr. King to crack, and they were not making progress. And they finally decided, when all the adults had been arrested and bailed out and arrested again, they would do something really radical, very controversial. They would enlist children, and it became known as the Children's Crusade. And if you remember, what finally turned the nation's stomach and really awakened many of us in the North to the plight of Southern blacks were the pictures of Bull Connors, police dogs, and water hoses turned on the children of Birmingham. Well, the fact of the matter is, they'd run out of money to bail the children out. And the whole crusade, on the verge of success, was also on the verge of coming undone. At this point, a call went out to Dr. King's lawyer. Nelson was off on his honeymoon in Venezuela with Happy, but his communications director instructed the lawyer to meet him in the vault of the Chase Manhattan Bank. It doesn't get much more establishment than that, where he was handed a briefcase full of money. And ostensibly, this was a loan. By the time Clarence Jones got back to Birmingham, he found a second note saying the loan had been forgiven, and there was $100,000 inside, which would pay the bail for an awful lot of Birmingham's youngsters. Tragically, 5 years later, when Dr. King was murdered in the spring of 1968, Nelson immediately got on the phone to Mrs. King, said, "What can we do?" And she said, "Do you have any people you could share?" And Nelson said his advance man, the best in the business, and his checkbook. And they organized and they paid for King's funeral. They found the mule-drawn wagon. A Rockefeller advance man took Dr. King's children to see him lying in state. It was all a Rockefeller production, and it was all kept secret. Press got wind of it. They wanted to write about it. He said, "No, we don't want to take advantage of the family's suffering." 2 months later, he repeated the gesture when Bobby Kennedy was killed. In the following weeks, a vacuum opened in American politics. Some of you may remember the height of dissatisfaction. LBJ had announced he wasn't running. Vietnam was more unpopular than ever. Richard Nixon was making his comeback in the Republican Party. Nelson, on again, off again. After he announced he wouldn't run, he was smuggled into the White House by LBJ, who twisted his arm, and the next day made it very clear he wanted him to succeed him. The next day, Rockefeller got into the race. But here's why he never became president. Because when Bobby Kennedy died, he effortlessly filled the void. Huge numbers of blacks and Latinos and other people who felt a kinship with Bobby Kennedy in particular poured out into the streets. You should have seen the crowds. And it wouldn't get him a single delegate to a Republican convention. So fine, Bobby Kennedy's supporters rallied to him. What good could that possibly do him in the race for a Republican nomination? Nelson Rockefeller never understood the difference between running a November campaign, where you appeal in those days, particularly to independents and Democrats, because the Republican Party in those days was so much smaller at its core. He never understood. He could always win a November election, but he could never win a Republican nomination. And in 1968, after losing on the first ballot, people don't know how close we came. I was 14 years old, and I was on the floor of the in the floor demonstration that night. My contribution to the political violence of 1968, I had my Rockefeller sign. I knew we were going to lose because the Reagan people weren't keeping up their end of the bargain. And in the end, guess what? We only won by 25 votes. We came within 25 votes of defeating Richard Nixon on the first ballot. And if Richard Nixon had lost on the first ballot, it's highly unlikely that he would have gone on to win on the second or third. Instead, you would have had this titanic battle between Rockefeller and Reagan. Who knows what would have happened? But I know what happened that night. I was frustrated, nothing I could do about it. I had my sign, my youthful idealism. We marched through the Iowa delegation, which consisted of a bunch of farmers for Nixon, one of whom I hit over the head with my sign. And it didn't get us any votes, but it felt awfully good. And at that moment, I established a kinship with the students at the Sorbonne who were trying to get rid of General de Gaulle. I mean, that was 1968. Nelson never understood that. The last thing I want to say, because this is, after all, the Ford Museum. It's no surprise that he was an unhappy vice president. He was a miserable vice president. He never should have taken the job. He never should have been offered the job. But that's easy to say in retrospect. He was, in truth, not cut out to be anybody's number two. He was a Rockefeller, and he'd been governor of New York for 15 years at a time when that job was automatically assumed to be the second toughest in America and a natural springboard to the presidency. That said, he did his best in a terribly awkward position. And he never blamed the president, even after he was dumped, and he was dumped. He didn't walk the plank, he was pushed. But he never blamed the president. Instead, he blamed Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney. Now, there are certain people who are put on the earth to piss each other off. That was the case with Donald Rumsfeld and Nelson Rockefeller. There's a lot in the book that's brand new, but I'll give you one story that goes to the heart of this bizarre distrust. And it sounds improbable, but someone who was there swears it happened. Nelson, in to hell with it mode, would walk by Rumsfeld's office in the morning, open the door, stick his head in, and shout to no one in particular, "Rummy, you're never going to be vice president." He had convinced himself that that was Rumsfeld's goal in life, and that's a fair guess. But it was doomed from the beginning. When President Ford, with the best of motives, and it says a lot about Gerald Ford, that he was willing to select this dynamic, colorful, polarizing, larger-than-life figure who brought a lot of baggage, but who also knew everyone around the world. Nelson was once asked to define power, and he said, "Oh, that's simple." He said, "I've never encountered anyone who won't take my phone call." Not a bad definition of power. President Ford asked him, Nelson, who had turned down the job, by the way, I didn't mention, 1968, Hubert Humphrey asked him to run for vice president with him on a national unity ticket after Nixon won the Republican nomination. And Rockefeller couldn't bring himself not only to abandon his party, but to accept this job that he'd been offered before and turned down. So why did he take it? Well, he took it because there was a constitutional crisis. The country was in profound trouble. President Ford appealed to him. He knew President Ford actually better than most people suspect. He thought highly of him. By the way, the night before, and this poisoned the well for the next 2.5 years, an inebriated Richard Nixon told Henry Kissinger that making Jerry Ford vice president was the biggest mistake Nixon had ever made. And that Rockefeller should have nothing to do with this Ford administration, which was going to be a disaster. And if Nelson would keep his distance, then in 1976, he could count on Nixon's support. Now, there are so many there are so many self-delusional statements in that paragraph that to untangle them all would take us more time than any of us have. But what's important is I think Nixon would have said the same thing if he was sober at that point. Remember, this is a man about to leave the White House, and the reason he had fundamentally miscalculated. He thought Gerald Ford was his insurance, that he wouldn't be impeached. What he didn't know is Congress had exactly the opposite viewpoint. That once Gerald Ford was installed as vice president, the idea of impeachment, painful as it was, suddenly became a whole lot more legitimate. In any event, Rockefeller, I talked to a number of people who tried to talk Nelson out of running and out of accepting this. They knew how miserable he'd be. They knew better than anyone else what his temperament was. And after 20 minutes, he told someone, "Look, everything you said makes perfect sense, but you're overlooking one thing. This is as close as I'm ever going to get." But to give you an idea of how unhappy a period that was, Hugh Morrow, Nelson's communications director, and probably closest aide over the longest period of time, on hearing the news about the assassination attempt in Sacramento, said, needless to say, privately, it's a good thing for the country that Squeaky Fromm was a lousy shot. In other words, Nelson Rockefeller was, at that stage in his life, not someone who should be in the Oval Office. He didn't age well, is how I would characterize it. I don't think there was ever a day in his life when he didn't want to be president. I think it haunted him. A month before he died, he told his nephew his life was a failure because he never became president of the United States. That's the saddest thing in the book. It's the saddest thing in the life. But it's not the sad things, I think, that he should be remembered for, and I do not for a moment think that he was a failure. Neil Pierce, a name I've forgotten today, but the preeminent journalist, political scientist in the 60s and 70s, wrote a book called The Megastates in 1973, in which he said flat out that Nelson Rockefeller was the finest, most innovative governor since World War II. It cost a lot. At one point, the top rate, income tax rate in New York, was 17%. But guess what? They got something for it. And let me end on this high note. In 1966, he ran for a third term. He was 30 points behind. He was always 30 points behind at the beginning of a re-election campaign because he was running against himself. and his taxes. And people were sick of him, and they were sick of his taxes, and his divorce, and his remarriage, and his endless running for president. They were just sick of him. They wanted him to go away. But most of all, they just wanted government to be smaller and cheaper. And sound familiar? But here's what he did. Instead of heeding what the public wanted or thought they wanted, Jim Cannon, the late great Ford biographer, Jim Cannon, told me that if he'd been born on the Lower East Side, he would have been the best barroom brawler in the neighborhood. He loved a good fight. And 1966 was not only a good fight, it was the kind of campaign we all say we would like to have, and we don't. What do I mean? It was a campaign about ideas. He went all over New York State for 18 months and basically put it to people, fine, if you cannot have it all. In other words, he broke it down. He'd go to every community and say, this is what these taxes paid for. These are the new schools you have. This is the new water pollution plant you have. This is the whatever program you have. This is the art center we built, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. 61% of New York's budget was returned to local communities. I don't know what it is in Michigan, but it can't be anywhere near that. So the fact of the matter is, people were paying taxes, but they were getting something for it. And then he had to visualize it. And again, a dyslexic, visuals. The most brilliant political campaign commercials ever made. You can go on YouTube and see them. There was the talking fish who told people how much life had improved since Governor Rockefeller's Pure Waters program had begun. There was this wonderful 60 seconds overhead shot of a road, just a highway, and you're moving along, but an aerial shot, and in the background, the unmistakable sounds, tinny sounds of Hawaiian luau music. What is the possible connection? And at the end of the commercial, a voiceover says, Governor Rockefeller has built enough roads to reach Honolulu and back. Well, these were ads that entertained, informed, persuaded, changed people's minds, changed the nature of the debate itself. So the debate didn't become just generic, I hate big government. The nature of the debate became, all right, I understand that, but then put that into effect on a day-to-day basis, and what of these programs, institutions, quote, benefits, are you willing to trade off in favor of your philosophical convictions? In other words, he forced a choice upon the people of New York. It's an amazing campaign. And it's been, we don't have campaigns like that anymore. We don't have campaign commercials like that anymore. We don't have candidates like that anymore. In part because for all his money and for all the, his mother said, surround yourself with people who are smarter than you. That was her solution to his alleged intellectual deficiency. And so there were always gurus and advisors. The difference is he didn't listen to them. If his gut told him and his belief, and he cared in the end about people. Final scene, I'll never forget it, a photographer told me the story. It was in the Bronx. The end of a campaign, long day, exhausted. It was pouring down rain. He cut his remarks short. There were several hundred people. It was a Puerto Rican neighborhood. And of course he spoke fluent Spanish, which was always a big hit. But then there was a woman, a sad woman, middle-aged woman, who looked much older than her age. And she had a daughter who was strung out on drugs and another daughter who was pregnant. I mean, it's just the personification of the broken family. But she wasn't a statistic. And this guy watched for 30 minutes. Because he never carried an umbrella. He was soaked to the skin, but he walked up and down the street listening to this woman's problems and making her feel that government cared. And then he did something. He made sure people on the staff followed through. He had a book that thick, and one person on the staff who had no job but to tend that book. And that book consisted of every campaign promise made over the previous 4 years and where it was, what status, where in the process of enactment it was. That's the way government is supposed to work. Questions? No. By the way, thank you for coming out tonight. I was tempted to say, you knew after 14 years it would be a cold day when I finished my book. But anyway, yeah.
In 1968, I worked in New Hampshire for George Romney, and then a bunch of us pivoted and went to work for House Rockefeller, which was the first paid job I ever had. And the question I have is, Rocky was very involved in supporting Romney.
Yes.
Up to the point that Romney withdrew.
Yep.
And then he equivocated.
Yes, he did.
Forth, and I worked in Maine, and we ended up stealing some Nixon delegates. But it was. Could you talk a little bit about the Romney-Rockefeller relationship?
Yeah, it's sad. I think, if, for example, if you talk to Mitt Romney today, it's an article of faith in the Romney family that Nelson was using their dad. And that's not true. I've explored this exhaustively, and I was a Romney supporter, and felt, in fact, the day he left, I got my father to drive us in a snowstorm to Manchester, New Hampshire, for the press conference, and then it snowed so much. I showed up, but the candidate didn't. So, story of my political life. It's sad. Lenore Romney, the governor's wife, who was, many people think the natural campaigner in the family. I mean, she was just, by all accounts, a wonderful woman, and she clearly felt that Nelson had used her husband as a stalking horse. The problem was the polls were abysmal, and not just in New Hampshire. Nixon had a 5-1 lead in New Hampshire, and he had a 3-1 lead in Wisconsin. And Wisconsin was always the Romney, kind of fallback position, obviously. But it just wasn't there. And it's sad, and in fact, I think in retrospect, lots of people, and not just in Michigan, came to have greater appreciation for George Romney's qualities, leadership qualities, individual character. They think, also, by the way, he was right about Vietnam. We were all brainwashed. He spoke the truth, and he paid a price for it. I shouldn't say this, but it's not the first time I've gotten myself in trouble for saying something I shouldn't say. Bill Seidman, the late great Bill Seidman, was a Romney emissary to the Rockefeller camp. The Rockefeller had an understanding with Romney. Any major speech had to be cleared with the Rockefeller organization, particularly in foreign policy, and that meant Henry Kissinger. And Nelson loaned Kissinger to the Romney. I mean, there's just too much evidence that Nelson was sincere in his support of Romney. But Bill Seidman did tell me the day Romney made that gaffe about being brainwashed, he said Kissinger took off and we never saw him again. Demonstrating a finely tuned instinct for survival, which would serve him well in the years to come. Anyway, yeah.
You want to talk about Rockefeller's trip to Latin America?
Well, yeah, actually, he and Nixon buried the hatchet after '68. Nelson realized that New York State got 5 cents on the dollar back for every dollar it sent to Washington. And he always said under Nixon, we did much better. We got it up to 19 cents. Plus, Nixon wanted to carry New York in 72. And so they had a mutuality of interest. So at the beginning of Nixon's term, representatives from Latin America, this was not something that Rockefeller had organized, had indicated to President Nixon on his first day in office, and as a matter of fact, someone from the OAS, the Organization of American States, suggested something like this. And it turned out very quickly to be the Rockefeller mission, which was 4 separate trips marked by violence almost everywhere he went. In some countries, he was in Venezuela, where he had a 18,000 acre ranch where he and Happy had celebrated their honeymoon. Venezuela refused to let him in as Richard Nixon's representative. So it was a very, very difficult time for him, but he was willing to walk through fire, and I think that he and Nixon actually became, now, they also had shared enemies, and there's no better way of bringing people together in politics than hating the same people. And of course, as you remember, Mr. Nixon had a rather prodigious capacity for that. In this particular case, they both hated John Lindsay. Nelson more immediately, Nixon more philosophically. Gerald Ford, by the way, suggested at the '68 convention to Nixon after his nomination that he put Lindsay on the ticket. I think he changed his mind later on. But in any event, long story short, they both had the same, not a chiropractor, osteopath, which is something that Nelson's grandfather swore by. And Nelson did too. He suffered all his life from chronic back pain. So I had this guy for 40 years who was his sidekick. I think occasionally his procurer. In any event, he performed many useful functions. And he kept a diary, thousands and thousands of pages of which I copied. And in May of 1971, he's at the White House treating his other patient, Richard Nixon. And so he's the go-between. The public had no idea that Nixon and Rockefeller were in touch as frequently as they were. Anyway, the situation in New York comes up, what a rotten guy Lindsay is. Nixon, and they talk about a Seabury-type investigation. Judge Seabury went after Jimmy Walker, and it led to Fiorello LaGuardia, okay? Nixon brings up wiretapping, and he wants to know what is New York's wiretapping law? Well, I suspect he knew, having lived in New York and been a lawyer there. But anyway, long story short, he follows up with a call. He tells this guy, tell Nelson he has anything he needs. The FBI, money, presumably wiretapping, if that's what it takes to get Lindsay. He followed up with a phone call from Camp David, reiterating his offer. A commission was established. Lindsay went to his grave, believing that it had been hatched in the White House, but he had no proof. Now he does. Then Lindsay announced a city commission to investigate the state. So he was investigating the state while the state was investigating the city. And meanwhile, they were both going to hell financially, with New York, of course, on the brink of bankruptcy by 1975, which is a significant part of the Ford story. Again, Bill Seidman, impeccable source, made it very clear from the beginning that President Ford was always at some point going to do something for New York. But there was a big fight, a huge fight within the administration between Rockefeller and Seidman, the sort of moderates. The tragically late Rod Hills was part of this group. And aligned against them, pretty formidable, was Rumsfeld, Alan Greenspan, Jim Lynn, Budget Department. Anyway, and it was the one time that I think Nixon and Ford had a real difference of opinion. And Rockefeller and Ford had a real difference. Rockefeller was in an impossible position, in New York, where he was going to go back anyway. And he was trying to broker a deal. And Ford was trying to maintain a hard line, not because that would be his eventual policy, but because the heart of by practicing tough love. Hugh Carey, who succeeded Rockefeller in the governorship, told me that Gerald Ford has never gotten the credit that he deserved for saving New York City. He said it was tough love that Ford practiced that brought the city finally to, if you remember, they took control away from Mayor Beam, lodged it in a state oversight agency. Politics broke down. Democracy didn't work, at least in that instance. Or maybe it worked all too well because it came up with an alternative structure. But in any event, the people of New York, of course, think of Gerald Ford and they think of the famous drop dead headline, which of course he never said, nor did he ever believe. He loved New York. As a young man, he'd spent a lot of time in New York. He had courted his first love in New York. In later years, he and Mrs. Ford very much looked forward every year before the holidays to going to the city, to take in shows, to shop. I mean, you know, he loved New York, to coin a phrase. But he also thought that New York had reached a reckoning point and that it was an example for the rest of the country. What complicated the matter was this was also the rise of the Reagan challenge. And the conservatives, the Rumsfelds and the Greenspans, I think believed that by beating up on New York verbally, it would demonstrate to the right wing of the Republican Party his bona fides as a true conservative. So it was very complicated, and unfortunately, the day before he gave the speech was the day that he asked Nelson to leave the ticket. Nelson was the ultimate good soldier. That weekend, he went back to Peconico, and he wrote the letter that the president had requested, and was perfectly prepared to present this as his decision and not something that was imposed on him. Privately and publicly, he never complained. Not only did he not complain, he produced the votes. He produced the New York and Pennsylvania delegations that put President Ford over the top at the convention in Kansas City. He nominated Bob Dole for vice president the last night of the convention. Now, that doesn't mean deep down he didn't, for a minute, suffer pangs of resentment. When I said he covered his tracks well, the only instance that I could find, and I looked, the only instance I could find where he expressed anger, and it was someone he knew would not talk. Senator Mac Mathias of Maryland, a liberal Republican, very much a Rockefeller Republican, called the day after this announcement was made just to offer commiserations. And Nelson heard him out, and he said, Mac, who wants to hang around with these shits anyway? And that was it. The only thing he ever said. Never let on to staff, never let on to family. Never show more surface than necessary. One more. Yeah. It was the hardest chapter to write. And it was the hardest chapter to write because, first of all, like everything else in the book, I wanted to present all sides without taking sides. This is the first time that the Rockefeller perspective has been incorporated, in part because no one has talked before. And the reason, it's interesting, when I started this book, when you embark on something like this, you play all sorts of head games, and you imagine, okay, what is the people are not going to want to talk about? Because there's always something. And you assume, in the case of Nelson, it's going to be the women, or the night he died, which are synonymous. But no, people were perfectly willing to talk about that. It was Attica. They didn't want to talk about Attica, which tells you something. Because amazingly, many of them were baffled. They did not understand why this man who thrust himself into any situation, who had, for example, on the Latin American trip, demonstrated raw physical courage. A young man was killed feet away, and to the horror of the security, Nelson, wanting to demonstrate machismos, just walked into the crowd. You know, I mean, they couldn't reconcile that with his reluctance / refusal to go to Attica. The problem with Attica is it's incredibly complicated. People over the years have come to conflate the horrible conditions in the prison, which no one could justify, with his decision not to go into these bizarre negotiations, which were being broadcast with outside observers who were not observers at all. I mean, but frankly, people with a very obvious political agenda. Today, it would not happen. The problem was when the takeover occurred, he wasn't in New York. He was in Washington. By the time he was back in New York, Russ Oswald, his commissioner, had made the critical, he thought fatal decision not to pursue an immediate retaking of the prison. Much of the prison had been retaken, but there were still over 1,000 prisoners who were at large, and of course, 30 plus hostages. So you had this situation where Rockefeller was in charge, but he wasn't in charge. But for most of the weekend, he wasn't part of the story. He was at Pragmatism, getting phone reports, et cetera, et cetera. On Sunday morning, the observers realized their mission had failed. Even though they had negotiated 28 points of reform based upon what the prisoners said they wanted. The problem was a guard died, a guard who had been physically assaulted in the initial takeover, and then the issue of amnesty became all that anyone wanted to talk about. The 28 points, constructively negotiated, went out the window. It all became about amnesty. The observers, including Tom Wicker, who wrote a very well-received book about this, clearly didn't want to acknowledge failure. They did not want the state to come in and violently retake the prison. So what did they do? They passed the hot potato to the governor. They got Nelson on the phone and for 90 minutes told him all the reasons why he should come to Attica. And his response was, and they couldn't refute this. If I come, the first thing they'll want is they'll want me to come in the prison yard. They'll want to negotiate with me. And when that doesn't work, they'll want the president or the Pope or someone. I talked to his aides who were there, who were on the phone, and he said, look, why am I coming? And the guy said, well, basically amnesty. And the other demand, they wanted to be transported out of the country to a non-imperialist third world country. Okay, that you could pretty much dismiss. But see, that's part of the reason why this chapter was so hard to write, because you have to take that seriously. 40 years ago, people took it seriously. 40 years later, it's harder for people in this climate, in this culture, to get their arms around what seems like a Paddy Chayefsky movie. Have you ever seen Network? I mean, the improbable, which has unfortunately come true on television. Anyway, so all of a sudden, the issue now is all about, will Nelson come to Attica? Television, leaped on this. His advisor said, go, just because if John Lindsay were in this situation, he would be up on top of the wall holding press conferences and, go for PR purposes. And he said, no, I'm not going to go for PR purposes. He said, there's a principle. He said, you can't run a state like that. You can't run a country like that. You can't run a civilization like that. Now, it was more than that. Yeah, I think there was principle involved. I think there was political calculation involved. I think there were a number of factors involved. I think the memory of his father and the Ludlow massacre was involved. I think there was, and again, this is why it takes 14 years. First of all, to tease all these strands before you put them back together again, to understand through the sheer mass of paper. I copied 60,000 pages of primary source research material out of the Rockefeller archives. I did 150 interviews of my own. But the great discovery was, and I'll end on this, Nelson in his last years, you asked what he did when he came back from Washington. Nelson was $10 million in hock to his trust. So he decided he needed some cash. So he would write a memoir. Now the book never got written, but he sat down and did over 500 pages of oral history with Hugh Morrow, somebody trusted implicitly. Not ever imagining that anyone else would ever see what he said. And it's pure gold. And I was the first person to gain access to not only that material, but 75 interviews that Hugh Morrow himself did after Nelson died. So you supplement that to everything else. It takes 14 years just to file that material, let alone read it and immerse yourself, marinate yourself to the point where I think I know Nelson Rockefeller better than probably most people who thought they knew Nelson Rockefeller. It does take over your life. You find yourself dreaming. You know, he invades your dreams. And you wonder in the course of the day, in any situation, what would Nelson do? In other words, it's a little sick. But, you know, hey, it beats taking tickets on the New Jersey Turnpike, you know? And that's not a put down, I mean, you know, but Nelson would have found a way to invade, you know, to raise that, or he would have built another turnpike. Listen, thank you so much for coming, and I think I'm going to be outside. Okay.